Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. Today I'm joined by Comrade Perrault to discuss something we've been meaning to talk about for some time on the show, and that is the Ukraine war. Welcome back, Comrade.
Hello, Mansa.
So it's been around 2.5 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. That was back in February 2022. And now this war, I think, has become so normalized. It's happening and there seems to be no end in sight. And the most recent news on this front is about Poland shooting down Russian drones that flew into Polish airspace, making one wonder if this is an escalation of sorts. Now, one of the things that I find quite frustrating and sometimes difficult is making sense of this war, because depending on your news source, you could think that Ukraine is winning or it's absolutely near collapse. So what I want to talk to you about today is how to make sense of this war, and as always, what should communists do about it? So let me start by asking what's happening currently on the battlefield and what's happening with the US and European efforts to help Zelensky.
Okay, well, those are already two big questions. Starting on what's going on in the battlefield, I think that's really a key question, because that's really what's driving everything else. Like all the diplomacy, everything else, everything you hear in the news is all really fundamentally determined at this point by what's happening on the battlefield. Now, you can find all kinds of analysts that will go like into details, explain every front line, where they're at, and so on. I'm not really in a position to do that. I think just very broadly, what's happening is that, it was always clear that Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine. And Ukraine did get like a huge amount of weapons from the West, mainly from the United States. However, this really large flow of weapons has not managed to push back the Russians. And in the years since the conflict began, the Russian army is just becoming bigger and bigger, more and more powerful. And the amount of aid that Ukraine is receiving is shrinking, and the amount of troops that Ukraine has is also shrinking. So what you're having is a gradual grinding down of the Ukrainian army. And so the Russians have been very methodical in their advances, really trying to destroy actually the Ukrainian army. And really what they call, one of the goals of Putin is what he calls demilitarization of Ukraine. And that's basically what they're doing.
Which is to what?
Exhausting, for example, like the anti-air ammunition, really physically destroying the army of Ukraine.
I.e. winning.
Basically. But also, what they want to do is guarantee that Ukraine's not going to be a threat for them in the future. What it's also doing more broadly is it's really draining the West of a lot of its military arsenal. So what's happening is the Russians are gradually advancing, gradually breaking down the Ukrainian army. And this is a war of attrition. And what happens in war of attrition is that, you have this gradual, which can seem almost a very slow process, until suddenly it's not a slow process anymore, and you have a collapse. I think that's what we're gradually going towards. And really, like the rhythm of the Russians' advances are becoming quicker, and you can really start seeing signs of the Ukrainian army starting to disintegrate.
I want to pick up on, there's lots in what you said already, which we'll come back to, but just the first thing that you started with, which is what's happening on the battlefield is actually determining or shaping diplomacy. Can you help us make sense of that? Because what does that mean? Are you trying to say that it's what's happening to, the Ukrainian army being ground down is why the Western imperialists are trying to put more pressure on Putin? Is that what you're trying to say? Or how do you make sense of this?
Yeah. Well, Marxists often quote the saying by Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics through other means. So basically, if this conflict erupted into an armed struggle, it's because the diplomacy wasn't sufficient to really kind of resolve the contest of political interests that was going on. And so it's really the war and who's winning this war that's really shaping what kind of political settlement will come out of it. For example, a lot has been said about Trump and his capitulation to Putin and whatever. But what you have to really understand to make sense of that is that the only reason that Trump is and the US more generally is even contemplating kind of the negotiations with Putin, it's because they're kind of running out of cards in terms of what they can do in Ukraine. They, from the start, ruled out going to war directly with Russia, which is a good thing because we'd be in a nuclear holocaust right now. And there's a limit to how much they are willing to actually commit in terms of resources to Ukraine, especially because they're really worried about China. They see this as their main theater for the future of their empire is China. So what Trump's negotiations is more a reflection of really of the limits of what can actually be achieved, like through this strategy for the US, and them trying to kind of find a bit of an exit plan. But if Ukraine had somehow defeated Russia or something like that, then, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. This is a result really of the actual state of the balance of forces in that region.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you want to talk about the Ukraine war and get into the nitty gritty, but what you're saying just makes me think about Trump's negotiations and so on. But the latest on this front, him trying to get Putin to capitulate is to go after India, right? And China even. So is that the framework you think that we need to deal with these questions?
I think what you have to understand, like if you look at what Trump's saying and doing, it kind of on the first level like makes no sense. One day he'll be saying one thing, one day he'll be trashing Zelensky, the next day he'll be trashing Putin, and it can seem just totally irrational. Like it is, the guy's pretty nutty. But beyond that, like what does this reflect? It's really that he's, the position of the US, they're kind of really just trying to perform a balancing act. Like Trump wants to somehow withdraw from this conflict. At the same time, the US has put a lot of political capital in supporting Ukraine. So if Ukraine just collapses, they're going to look very bad from that. And, Trump is probably going to be blamed for this defeat. So he's trying to kind of do both things. And that's why, it's really not these negotiations that are determining anything. And I think more and more it's becoming clear for those that follow the Ukraine war that really what's going to determine the outcome is really when the Russians beat the Ukrainians. Then it's going to be easier for Trump to kind of, we did what we could and so on. And then we'll see if there's some kind of settlement between the Americans and the Russians.
So in your assessment, you think that the West can't quite, stop helping Ukraine because it's a bad look. So they're just going to slowly wait for Ukraine to be defeated on the military.
The Europeans that you mentioned at the beginning, they're like, a lot of these governments in Europe really have committed, like basically stake their whole careers on supporting Ukraine. So they have to keep up the act, we're going to give money, we're going to give blah, blah, blah. But the truth is that they can't do anything really without the Americans. And so that is how this conflict is unfortunately going to be resolved.
Yeah, I also find it just hilarious that, the coalition of the willing, Starmer, Macron, like these guys just, French government just fell. Macron's approval rating sucks. Starmer, it's scandal after scandal after scandal after resignation after sacking after sacking. So it's like, what are they going to do, But it's kind of these sort of the last sort of remaining liberal leaders of the Western world.
Yeah, honestly, it's a total joke. Everybody that follows this attentively knows that this is a total joke. These leaders are totally impotent. And it's really pushing kind of the regime, the status quo of the last decades to its extreme, of like totally empty posturing, that's like symbolic and empty. To the point that even Zelensky is starting to be tired of it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I appreciate you setting up kind of just what's happening and sort of the political dynamics of that. But let's get to the actual Ukraine war. What we haven't said so far is, well, we're communists. What's our position? I just want to get that clear on the record before we actually start breaking down why we have this position and how we arrived at it.
So the short answer is that we oppose both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. And our perspective is to forge the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian workers against American imperialism and against their own ruling classes in each country. So we call for fraternization, to turn the guns around, and so on. So a policy of revolutionary defeatism, both in Ukraine and in Russia.
First thing I'll ask is, often I try to ask my questions trying to make communist politics more accessible to an average listener. So I guess, you mentioned to unite the Ukrainian and Russian workers in opposition to American imperialism and their unruling classes. Why American imperialism? I mean, yes, okay, they're funding Ukraine and so on and so forth, but why is that one of the key points?
Yeah. Well, I think a key point is, and I think it's not so complicated to understand, is that really it's the US that fostered this conflict. Mm-hmm. If you look at, the policy of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union, it has been constant expansion towards Russia and trying to, more and more squeeze Russia. That's the main force creating chaos around the world is the United States. Honestly, if you look at the news, that's pretty obvious. Who's doing the war and who's supporting Israel, who's bombing, who's threatening Venezuela right now. It's really very clear that the US is the main force kind of destabilizing the world.
Yeah. Has been and is, right. Okay, so that's American imperialism. But I guess, can you walk us through? Obviously, on the left, there's all kinds of positions. There's pro-Ukrainian socialists, there's pro-Russian socialists, and there's also, those who have the revolutionary defeatist position, although I think that's a really small minority. Help us to understand how the Spartacists arrive at this position.
Yeah.
Like, what is the starting point for understanding this?
I'll start by saying what's not our starting point. A lot on the left, they just they go for like an easy, very rigid answer. Who's imperialist? Who started the war? Or like a very rigid analytical framework from which they just automatically deduce the position they should take. So our starting point is not like what's imperialist, what's not imperialist, like as abstract categories, but a very basic point. How do you unite the working class internationally? And how do you advance the struggles of workers internationally? So the whole approach of our position is to put forward a policy that can forge this unity, that's actually able to unite workers across borders. So it's actually very, very basic in terms of an approach.
But why is this the approach? Like, why? Like, why is the other left stupid? Why is this our approach and not theirs? Like, I'm trying to understand.
There's two questions. The first is, why is that our approach? Yeah. Well, because we're Marxists, and the point of Marxists is to advance the interests of the working class internationally. And so that means whether on all positions, you have to always approach the interests of the working class internationally and to see how you can unite it on in a common struggle against their enemies to advance its liberation. So that's our approach for every question, really. Why it's not the approach of others? Well, there's different questions. One of the big things is there's the pressures that you get from your own ruling class, which, leads some to capitulate really to the interest of their own ruling class. For example, a lot of the pro-Ukrainian groups and positions, that's just a direct reflection of what their own ruling classes are saying. So basically, Starmer or, 100% pro-Ukraine and so on. And so you have an important part of the British labor movement that is pro-Ukraine, as a direct, that just basically echo the arguments of the ruling class. Then you have others who kind of want to reject like this capitulation, open capitulation, and then they just take very like kind of mirror positions. Mm-hmm. So then that means then we side with Russia. You want to oppose the Western imperialists, then that means you support Russia. Yeah. And it's just a very kind of, just vulgar like flip-flop, as opposed to, really thinking how can you actually unite workers?
I do want to get one question off the agenda, so to speak, which is that there is obviously this trend in the left that Russia's imperialist, so therefore you have to oppose Russia. Like, I guess my question is, we started by talking about how you have to oppose imperialism and unite the working class in opposition to imperialism. How do you respond to those who actually say, well, Russia's also imperialist, so you can't, therefore...
Yeah. I think what gets forgotten often is like, what is the point of these categories? Imperialism, socialism, working class, bourgeois, like what is the point of these categories? The point of these categories is to help understand what needs to be done, to help guide like how to advance the interests of the working class. So what's the point of this category, imperialism? Why is that important? It's because it flows from their understanding that there are some powers in the world, a few powers, that basically dominate most of the rest of the world. That was the whole purpose of Lenin's development of what is imperialism. And it actually stemmed from the point of view, how do you unite the working class internationally? A basic point is, if you look at the British Empire, how do you unite British workers and Indian colonial subjects? Well, you have to understand that there's, that one group is oppressed by the other. And so it puts different responsibilities on the working class of these different places. So in India, there's a struggle against the British Empire for their national liberation from this imperialist exploitation. And in Britain, it brought certain tasks for the working class in Britain to fight for the liberation of the Indian masses and against the empire as a whole. Because the point is, you can't unite British workers and Indian workers if the British workers defend the empire. So basically, that's the point. So going back to Russia, this is a bit of a detour, but Russia does not oppress workers around the world. It simply doesn't. Okay, obviously it oppresses Ukrainians, right, in the regions that it controls and obviously there's a lot of national minorities within Russia. But what other country does it subjugate? It helped dictatorial regimes kind of in its region and Syria. But even then, it's they were assisting their partners, basically. They're not imposing the foreign policy and controlling the economy of countries all around the world. It's a totally different scale from what the United States is doing. So you have to understand that the United States oppresses people and the working class all around the world. And its allies that are partners in this system benefit from this, from the financial strangulation and so on. Russia is not part of this club. And so it poses different tasks in terms of uniting the proletariat.
I see.
This is a very roundabout way of answering your question. I don't know if it did.
Yeah, you did. I do think it's, I'm thinking of, for example, the trends who do think Russia is imperialist, because their whole methodology is okay, well, let's get out our accounting books and look at the export of capital and how bad Russia's actions are towards other countries. Well, nobody said that Putin is doing great things around the world. It's Putin. It's really to deform what was actually Lenin's point about imperialism, I guess.
Very concretely, why this is important in the case of the Ukraine war is to understand the force that provoked this is not Russian expansionism. Russia hasn't been expanding since the 1990s. It's been the US that's been expanding. Its empire has been the one that has been expanding since the 1990s. So you just have to understand that correctly to be able to make sense of anything that's going on. And what Russia did is its war in Ukraine is reactionary, but it's really pushing back in its sphere of influence from what it sees as encroachment from the United States and its allies.
Yeah. And I think those who support Russia say, okay, well, it's fighting against imperialism, right?
Exactly.
And therefore, it's the duty to push back against imperialism and therefore to critically support Russia's war efforts, right? Okay. I think we're going in multiple different directions, but okay. To bring it back to spelling out our position, right? Okay. So revolutionary defeatism, I think the broad, outlines, okay, fine. But I guess, how do you unite two working classes who are currently at war? And, it has, there's real flesh and meat on this thing. There is national oppression. There is historically great Russian chauvinism and those ideas about Ukrainians and Russians and so on. There is, opposing armies killing each other. So there's all of that. So how do you tell a Ukrainian worker, okay, well, you have to oppose your ruling class, which is spreading the view that actually we're defending ourselves against Russia?
Yeah.
How do you break that Ukrainian soldier or worker from that ideology?
Yeah. That's
or
really,
why do you do it, actually? So I guess, why do the Ukrainian and Russian workers need to oppose their ruling classes?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's really the key question. So how do you make this argument? It's not an easy argument to make. Ourselves, we don't have any supporters in these countries, so our ability to really develop these arguments and make them concrete are limited. So it's going to be fairly general, my answer. But so the first point to make is to the Ukraine side is to look at what's actually happening in their country. It's being totally devastated. Russia is advancing, and the prospect is going to be that their country is probably in large part going to be occupied by Russia. Its government probably subordinated some way, and the other half of the country, or we'll see how it happens, is probably going to be pillaged by the US and NATO. So that's really the prospects that are facing the Ukrainian working class. So part of the argument we need to make is that, well, how actually is there a chance to defend Ukrainian sovereignty in this context? And so the whole way the current war has been waged, the whole strategy of Zelensky is all based on an alliance with the United States. They've been doing these crazy offensive. He does not want to cede an inch of territory, and putting soldiers' lives at risk in absolutely impossible operations, all to keep the public image alive of Ukraine resisting so that they can get weapons. And basically, a lot of these operations have basically been dictated and organized by the generals in the US. So, yeah, quite directly. So, one basic point to make is that this alliance with the United States and the Zelensky government that is totally subordinating the defense of Ukraine to the US is an absolute disaster. It is not winning. It is leading to the massacre of soldiers and is really a disastrous position. If there's going to be any hope to protect the Ukrainian national rights, you have to break this total subordination to imperialism, and that means you have to oppose the Zelensky government. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is how are you going to actually push back against the Russians? Well, one of the main arguments of the Russian ruling class to prosecute this war is that, Ukraine is this pawn of the US. That's one of the things that are motivating the soldiers in Russia to go and fight in this war. Because it's actually historically, yes, there's of course, oppression of Ukrainians by Russia historically, but there's also very strong bonds, cultural and family bonds between these two countries. So it was not so easy to get, the Russians to go and want to fight in Ukraine. So this kind of idea that you're doing this against the United States is really key. So that's another argument of why breaking this connection with the United States and breaking with the Zelensky regime and all the other kind of pro-imperialist cronies that are ruling Ukraine is really necessary. Now, this brings me to the other question, which is the national question in Ukraine, and that's also a really key part of the equation. So what happened is that when there was this coup in 2014 in Ukraine that installed a pro-Western government in Ukraine, they took a series of measures against Russian minorities in the east of Ukraine. And that's where kind of the conflict started. You had armed rebellions in certain regions of Ukraine by pro-Russian forces. And then you had also Crimea that, joined Russia, where Crimea is the overwhelming majority of the population there is Russian and pro-Russian.
And these regions that you're talking about, you're referring to which regions?
So the Donbass, mainly. Now there's a lot of disputes about how many pro-Russians are in each region. It's very contentious. So listen, I don't know exactly, obviously, what's there. But I think what's pretty much undeniable is that there's a very strong, pro-Russian population in the Donbass. That is, nobody can deny that. And Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian and pro-Russian. Nobody denies that. Well, most people will not deny that. So the thing is what's fueled this whole conflict for years is these anti-Russian measures taken by the Ukrainian government. And a lot of the left does not, in Ukraine and internationally, does not oppose these policies or does not strongly oppose this kind of Ukrainian nationalist perspective towards these regions. And so that's another thing that's really fueling the war effort in Russia is that, well, we're fighting for the democratic rights of these Russian minorities. And so it's really actually been disastrous for Ukraine because they can't beat Russia on a one-on-one fight and even with the help of, the West. And so them saying we're going to reconquer Crimea, which is basically the official war aims of Ukraine right now, is really a disaster. And if it were actually to happen, which it's not going to happen, it would mean what? It would not mean the national liberation of Ukraine. It would mean the occupation of Russian regions by Ukraine. And so that would not bring forth the unity of the working class.
There's a lot of moving parts.
Yes.
And I feel a little bit sorry for people who are less familiar with these questions because so I'm going to try and distill it. I don't know if I'll be successful. But so, you mentioned Ukrainian sovereignty. So as communists, we fight for Ukrainians or the national rights of Ukraine?
We're against the national oppression of any country. That a country gets subordinated by another is never good.
Mm-hmm. So in our calculations of, how to arrive at our tasks, it is important how Ukraine will actually secure its or not get nationally oppressed by Russia. However, at the same time, then it's within Ukraine, there's national oppression going on against the Russian minorities. And through the policy of kind of keeping down, the Russian minorities in Crimea, Donbass, etc., that's also actually undermining the fight for Ukrainian national sovereignty.
Let me try to put it simply, because I understand it was not maybe not very clear.
Just for our listeners, just to let them know, you basically follow this war pretty closely, and you monitor, you listen to various commentators on what's happening on the battlefield. So you've been like in this.
Yeah, but that's not even what I'm talking about, you know?
No, but it's like you're quite familiar, you know?
Yeah.
But anyways.
Let me just put it very simply. Like, the only way to unite the Russians and the Ukrainians is if the democratic rights of each side are respected. So that means that each side get to determine, the populations of Ukraine can decide whether they want to be with Ukraine or with Russia, and they can speak in their language without being any constraints against that. So it's a very basic thing. Actually.
I mean, in words it is. It's just in reality, it never happened.
Exactly.
Because, one's democratic rights are seen as a threat to the rights of others or whatever, or something like that, something along those lines. Because, it does sound simple. Like, hey, let's just agree to get along and figure out where we live or what country we want to belong to. But that's never how it happens.
Of course. Why? It's because you have ruling classes in each of these countries that have, nationalist agendas that go beyond just defending their own national rights. So, the Ukrainian government and the whole Ukrainian regime is absolutely determined to reclaim the borders of Ukraine from 1991. And that would mean the subjugation of pro-Russian regions to Ukraine. As I said, that's not going to happen. But that is their aim. On the Russian side, if they get what they want, what they would like to, they don't really see Ukrainian nation as a legitimate thing. And they basically kind of consider it, if not all of Ukraine, at least very, very big chunks should actually rightfully belong to Russia, including those where there's not a pro-Russian majority.
I see. So to speak more about the ruling classes, right? So you've laid out Zelensky, his pro-Western, just like the Zelensky policy is actually driving the defeat of Ukraine, right? His subordination to the US. And actually, nobody talks about this as much anymore, but the way in which he was humiliated when he went to the White House is really an example of they don't care about Ukraine. The West does not really care about Ukraine. It's more about what their own interests are. But putting Ukraine to the side, now let's turn to Russia, I guess, and talk about, you spoke a little bit about, what's at stake in terms of their war efforts, right? Obviously, there's a territorial question. There's, we want to fight against Ukraine because they're pro-American, etc. But then I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about NATO and the sort of constant eastward expansion of NATO and how that provoked Russia into this and how that, what's the end game with the whole NATO question?
Yeah. Well, so Russia, of course, they want to, they say they want to defend the Russian populations in Ukraine. But that's not really the main thing really on driving the conflict. The main thing is what we're talking about is this expansion from NATO. And that's, I think, probably the primary objective of Russia is to try to halt this eastern expansion of NATO and to get some kind of deal with the Americans in terms of securing those borders on Russia's eastern flank. That's kind of what they would like to achieve. And that is why, Putin's engaging in diplomacy with the United States, because ultimately that's what he wants. And it's, we'll see if if they ever come to some kind of agreement. But that's kind of the end goal of Russia.
Yeah, I would like to bring this to the discussion. I'd like to bring it to the broader world situation. But before we do that, I wonder if you could spell out a little bit. We've written a lot of articles on the Ukraine war. We've taken up, for example, what the task of socialists should be in the West and how to fight to advance the unity of the working class here, right? Like outside of Russia and Ukraine and so on. I wonder if you could take us through some of the ways in which you would motivate a revolutionary defeatist position concretely to a Ukrainian or a Russian listening right now.
Yeah, well, I already made a few points about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Russia, I think the point is about how to defeat imperialism. So, of course, how to fight against the United States, the threat from NATO and the United States and so on. And the basic argument to make there is that oppressing the Ukrainians will not reduce the risks and will not be it's not the best way to push back against Western imperialism, but it's actually an alliance with the working class of Ukraine and actually all of Eastern Europe, and ultimately with the working class of the West itself. And that, if Russia occupies parts of Ukraine and oppresses Ukrainian national minorities, that this is going to weaken the Russian working class by tying it with its own ruling class and also really making an enemy out of Ukraine, which is actually going to, present a perpetual opening for the imperialists to undermine Russia.
So if I understand it correctly, on the Ukrainian side, you have to break with US imperialism and the Ukrainian ruling class, which is pro-imperialist. So there's, that anti-imperialist perspective there. And then on the Russian side, actually, I assume there is a strong anti-imperialist sentiment, i.e. anti-US sentiment in Russia. So it's, again, this question of anti-imperialism. So to put that sort of at the root of how to build unity by showing, okay, well, it's the machinations of the US, over the last 3.5 decades that have eventually provoked this, and that really to fight against that, you need to unite against it. But then to show also how their ruling classes are actually an obstacle to
it. Well, one of the good examples is Putin ultimately will want some kind of deal with the imperialists. And
I think you say it's obvious. Why?
Well, he's negotiating with Trump and so on, and even you just look at what he wants, what does he say he wants? He doesn't want to, end US's oppression around the world. He just wants to secure Russia's position and make sure that the US doesn't come and encroach on, the Russian capitalist sphere of influence. That's what he's trying to do.
But what about the BRICS?
Well, what about the BRICS?
You tell me. I mean, come on, the SCO just happened. And, I'm being a bit facetious, but the point I'm trying to make is that, there is that trend in the left, which is like, look, Trump is just driving Modi and Xi and Putin closer together, and the anti-imperialist bloc is getting stronger. So to some, it's not very obvious that Putin wants to make a deal with the US.
Listen, I feel like you're trying to bring me on a whole different subject here, but
a short answer.
Short answer.
Possible.
Listen, I think the point is this. I think this is kind of obvious. Like, Putin does not want to defeat or destroy U.S. imperialism. And honestly, you just have to look at what he has said. He's never said that. He's never claimed that. Same thing for the BRICS. They've never said they want to end U.S. tyranny on the world. They just want to secure their own little spot, and push back against American encroachment. So that's their goal. And the problem with that in terms of Russia is that, there's also a very oppressive regime in Russia for the Russian working class. And, what benefits the Russian ruling class is not what's going to benefit the working class in Russia. And it kind of striking some kind of reactionary deal with the US is not what's going to be to the advantage of Russian workers.
This brings to mind one thing which I read about recently, which is, and you mentioned this at the start, which is that as the war has gone on, Russia's military has gotten stronger. And there's actually a huge development in terms of Russia's industrial sort of capacity. I was just wondering, because you hear about how great the salaries are that the soldiers are taking home. There's a lot more jobs to do with the arms factories now. I'm wondering how to argue against that for Russian.
Yeah, well, if Russia continues like its military buildup, and views its way of securing its economic future through this kind of leaning on this military industrial complex, it's going to mean what? It's going to mean wars. It's going to mean workers being sent to die and kill, which is obviously going to be a disaster for Russian people, and this kind of perpetual kind of state of war. If somehow the economy shifts back to a more kind of less military focused, I think you're going to have a lot of unemployment. So we'll see what happens. But, it's not going to be good in the long term for Russia to have, and for the Russian working class to have such a kind of military focus. Even if it's not Russia that's directly at war, if they're just kind of selling weapons across the world, well, that means there's wars in other countries, and, nothing stays isolated in national frontiers these days.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's just I hadn't considered prior to reading this about the sort of more conservatizing forces as a result of this war being dragged on, that consciousness changes obviously, and it's a material thing. So speaking of consciousness changing, you had also mentioned at the start about the Ukrainian army being ground on. One of the things I think that we've seen pretty regularly for well over a year is Ukrainians either deserting or, going abroad so that they can escape conscription and so on. I wonder if you had anything to say on that.
I think these are very important. What's really tragic is that nobody, when we put forward our position, frankly, people think this is absolutely nothing to do with what's actually going on in the ground. That some kind of independent move by the working class is absolutely impossible in the current conflict. But if you look at what's actually happening in the Ukrainian army, this is a catastrophe that's building. And I'm sure there's a lot of ferment and revolutionary potential even within the army and within Ukrainian society at large. The key question is, why isn't any of that kind of taking a working class angle? And the reason is because the Ukrainian left, now I'm really not an expert on this, but it's really divided on either on the pro-Russian side or somehow supporting the war effort of the Zelensky government. So there's not this kind of independent working class alternative that's put forward within Ukraine. And so this ferment that exists, if it explodes, is not going to explode in all likelihood in a progressive direction.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's actually, I don't know, I think reading about the many instances where either, they're trying to recruit men who are much older than ideal or young, really, really young men, teenage boys in many cases. It shows on the one hand the desperation of the situation and also how I think people are not happy. And it is absolutely a complete failure of the left in Ukraine and internationally that there isn't a stronger, independent working class perspective that can really tap into this and put forward a strategy to actually advance their interests.
What we're seeing in Ukraine is the destruction of basically a whole part of the male population is being sent to the slaughter. And there is real revolutionary potential in this. There's the saying, war is the mother of revolution. And that's really what's criminal, is that nobody's actually trying to really seriously fight for such a perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite tragic. I want to broaden out a little bit. Now, we've touched on this throughout in different ways. What you say, war being the mother of revolution. I think it sounds quite apt when you're looking at this war, in the way that we've been talking. But then you step back and, as I said at the start, it's become so normalized. It's just part of the tapestry of the current sort of breakdown of the world that's happening right now. And it's quite normalized. And I wonder, how do you make sense of the Ukraine question in the big picture of how US imperialism is trying to regain its power and influence and so on? How do we make sense of this and how the cards will fall?
I think that's a very good question. In a lot of countries in the West, you could almost forget that the war is even happening. You're getting less and less headlines about the Ukraine war. And the reason is because it's not going well. You get the positive headlines when, Ukraine is doing some kind of, success or whatever. And then when it starts going bad, then it goes silent. But that's not going to last forever. At a certain point, the dam will break and it will be very clear that Ukraine is being crushed. And I think what you'll get is a real panic in the West. I'm sure that panic already is happening under the surface. Because what does it represent, going back to your question? It really is a very concrete embodiment of the decline of US imperialism. The US has not suffered any kind of defeat on the scale of the Ukraine war in decades. This is going to be really, really a show to the world that the US, despite the massive resources it poured into this conflict, was beaten. And so I think that will really kind of shake things up. How, it's very difficult to know, but it's going to for sure create major political crises.
So I want to also touch on, in our current issue of Spartacus, we have this article, US Imperialism Turns the Screws, which is, our take on what exactly happened, to make sense of Trump and what the implications of this will be on different fronts. One of the projections we make in that article is a possibility of a sort of realignment between Russia and the US. I wonder if you could comment on that, because I think many people will read or listen to this and say, you guys are crazy. So I wonder if you could maybe help us understand what was behind that projection.
Yeah.
Do you still stick by it, or?
It's a possibility, like any projection, it's like or prediction, it's a possibility. You can weigh how likely it is or not. So the media really, it's always zigzagging in a very frantic way. So one day is like, that's it, Trump is capitulating. Now it's like, no, it's going, there's the conflict is heightening and so on. So it's like, it's always very impressionistic and very like short, the horizon is short term and very hysterical. But what the reason why we're making this projection is that if you look at what the US's weakening position in the world, its need really to kind of confront China. The fact that Russia does not actually want to beat the United States, it's not trying to, and that it is actually looking for some kind of deal with the United States. Like there's an interest for the US to kind of find some kind of deal with Russia.
Now, isolate China.
Now, I explained already a little bit some of the political difficulties. I'm not, in terms of that actually happening. And one of the main difficulties is the US actually willing to swallow a defeat. So we'll see how and if that happens. There's also another element is that, this show of American weakness in Europe really has the potential to destabilize Europe. Because what has kept Europe peaceful, everybody says, oh, it's the EU and blah, blah, blah. We learned the lessons. But that's all false. What has kept the peace in Europe is American dominance. That's the basis for the EU. It's the main military power in Europe since in the western part, has been the United States. And that's what keeps peace in Europe. Now, if Europe, American power is seen to not be so strong, then you can see all kinds of fractures. So, but the thing is that Russia also doesn't really have an interest in an unstable Europe that's rearming and so on. So there could be some kind of deal, and you can kind of also see an ideological alignment potentially in terms of this kind of Christian, right-wing conservative values, that where you could see some kind of alignment between the US, Russia, and even some of the European ruling classes. Now, this is it's a possibility. I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, but I think what's important in projecting that is just kind of understanding what are the kind of the forces at play and how they move and react with each other.
Definitely, I think, not a viewpoint that's that I've I was going to say not a viewpoint I've heard before. Obviously, I have, but it's not a very common one.
Well, it depends. A few months ago, everybody was like, "That's it, Putin and Trump are aligning." So it changes. These things change quickly.
And I think, again, this is why this war, you have to wade through so much to actually try and make sense of it. So I guess, what's one thing that you think is, how do you kind of cut through the hysteria around this question?
Yeah.
The daily bites of information?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all is approaching every question by starting with the interests of the working class. Mm-hmm. How do you advance the interests of the international working class? Mm-hmm. How do you unite it? And the other is to try to look at the kind of objective economic and political forces behind whatever's happening. So, if you understand, the war is a very material thing. It's depends on logistics, on the amount of weaponry you can produce and so on, and the amount of manpower you have. These are very objective forces. And so if you kind of keep your eye on that, on what's objectively happening, then you can make more sense and kind of ignore more of the hype in the headlines and so on.
I wonder if, obviously you mentioned that, we don't exist in Ukraine, in Russia, etc. But we have been fighting for this perspective where we do exist, and that's mostly in the West. And I want to talk a little bit about that. How does this position on a war that's far away, how do we as communists still continue to fight for that position to try and advance that perspective?
So in the West, the basic position that we argue is you need to oppose the foreign policy of your own government. That the foreign policy of Britain, the United States, Germany, they're not trying to bring peace around the world. They're causing disasters around the world, and they're making the working class pay for it at home.
Yeah, I think Germany is actually a really good example of how they sort of consciously like shut their eyes and shot themselves in both,
Yeah.
with this. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So that's kind of the basic argument, and I think it's not an impossible argument to make. It that all these foreign adventures, these military interventions, they are just creating more and more chaos around the world, more and more destruction around the world, and that this all comes back against the working class at home. So that's kind of the key argument we're trying to make. And then what's the kind of, how do we fight for this concretely, is in the workers' movement, in the unions, among the left, the unions and some of the political parties that are at the head of the working class. They defend the policy of the ruling class. They support NATO. They support sending arms to Ukraine and so on. So we try to really fight against the influence of these leaders of the workers' movement that are binding workers to their own ruling class to the detriment of their own interests. One thing that we confront a lot among especially more privileged layers of the working class is that their own kind of position is dependent on the fortunes of, the empire.
Yeah, I think this is especially true in the US.
Yeah.
I know, sorry, go on. Like either the arms industry or, for example, longshore, right? Because, well, it keeps the job, keeps the money flowing. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, the argument's not so different, but it is a strong pull, especially like when the sectors where the ruling class can afford to kind of spend some money to kind of corrupt some of the layers, the upper layers. But the argument fundamentally doesn't change. It's, this is not in your interest, because if you look at, first of all, it's, killing working class people, that when you go into war in some foreign conflict, it's, body bags that are coming home. It creates total devastation abroad, which end up coming back eventually on the shores of the United States. But also it's the stronger the US's hold abroad, the more it exploits and other countries, the more it can subjugate its own working class. And that actually the American working class has a total interest in aligning with workers around the world against their common enemy. Black workers in the United States, they live under the boot of American imperialist terror. And so they don't have an interest in aligning with with Trump and their own ruling class in exploiting other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, of course, these are some of the most basic arguments in the socialist Marxist arsenal, right? But again, there's the influence of the ruling class itself. So, for example, the mainstream in Britain, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course you would back Ukraine because Russia's authoritarian, and then we got to go save the good people who are, fighting for democracy against the big bad guys. And that's where it gets more murky in terms of motivating these arguments. Yeah. And this is also where I think you really see the totally corrupting influence of the trade union leaders.
Yeah. A quick answer to that is like, who actually thinks that Keir Starmer gives a rat's ass about democracy? You have to be pretty stupid to think that is what's motivating Keir Starmer when he's like totally censoring everything on internet, throwing people in jail, banning Palestine action. Like really, that's democracy. Democracy is what animates this guy. Like, come on.
That is a pretty convincing point, I would think. But think about the trade union bureaucracy. So think about, we do work in the unions. You mentioned trade union leaders who totally, pro NATO, back the policies of their government and so on. Could you maybe take us through some examples of how to actually concretely fight for that in the union and in the left? Because I know that's some of our campaigns that we've done. I guess what I'm trying to actually get you to talk about is fighting for that split in the labor movement against the social chauvinists, because Leninism 101.
Yeah. Well, I think in each country, how we've been kind of pushing this question depends very much on the national terrain. So, in Britain, for example, and your party, this new party that's being founded by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, if it ever actually exists. What we're fighting for is we're fighting for this party to oppose NATO, which is going to be a very hard line because all the trade unions support basically NATO and support Ukraine. So this is a very concrete question there. So our fight, and we try to argue, like, why do you need to oppose NATO to actually win the working class, and unite it in a struggle against the ruling class? So that's kind of a key part of our intervention. At this point about why you should oppose the U.S. ruling class, that was a key point in our intervention in the ILA strike last year. Where the DAGID bureaucracy really.
This is longshore on the East Coast.
Yes. the Daggett bureaucracy really very explicitly took a position to not strike military hardware, and which undermined the power of the strike they were doing. And so those were part of the arguments we used at the time to explain like why actually, if you want to advance the interests of the ILA workers, you need to oppose this nationalist, flag-waving, patriotic policy. In Germany, you have the whole the rise of the right, the AfD, and you have the whole like left kind of getting behind this like nationalist pro-Ukraine policy of the ruling class, which is very, very committed to this pro-Ukraine policy. And you see the working class being ground down as a result. So what we're trying to do there is, have been trying to do is to really kind of push this anger against the consequences of this pro-Ukraine policy, and to foster a split, for example, in Die Linke, and to throw out the pro-NATO, pro-Zionist leaders of that party.
Okay, so to basically show the disastrous result of NATO for the working class at home, and then to put those who talk left but back NATO on the spot to show how they're actually holding back the struggles and the interests of the working.
Yeah. In each case, it's always the same thing. We want to show why the workers in a given country do not have an interest in aligning with the foreign policy of their rulers, and why they actually need to be anti-imperialists to advance their own struggle at home.
I want to ask this question because obviously those socialist groups who have, say, for example, a pro-Ukraine position, they're not pro-Ukrainian because they're like, oh, well, Britain is pro-Ukraine, so let me be pro-Ukraine,
Of course.
But they end up objectively sharing the same aims and interests. I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit, because I can see anybody who's pro-Ukraine listening to this just bursting into flames saying, how dare you say this? Because obviously they're driven by different motivations or interests or whatever. But ultimately, I think what they end up minimizing is the fact that, well, objectively, it does put them in an alliance with the aims of their government. So
each, the pro-Ukrainian and the pro-Russian side in the left, they all have to ignore parts of the question. So or say they're not important, basically. So basically, the pro-Ukrainian side is very focused on the fight against national oppression in Ukraine, against Russian oppression. And that's what they see. And then everything like the whole expansion of NATO, the subordination, like those are deemed basically secondary questions. So the main thing is the struggle against national oppression. And so you must support Ukraine in this struggle. But what it totally negates is what I've explained before, like how actually this subordination to imperialism, it's not a secondary question. It dictates the whole way this war is being waged. Right. And it dooms actually Ukraine struggle for national liberation. So that's the mistake they make. On the Russian side, what they deny is the Ukrainian national question. They deem that is basically a secondary thing. The main thing is the struggle against imperialism, pushing back the US, and Ukrainian national rights don't exist or are irrelevant. But actually, if you want to be the United States, the Ukrainian national rights are not irrelevant. You cannot really defeat the US with alliance with the Russian ruling class at the expense of Ukrainian workers. And I already talked about this kind of creating a perpetual enemy with the Ukrainian nation is not going to advance the struggle against imperialism.
It just makes me think how pertinent this approach is for all of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Actually, given just how deep those divisions and conflicts go sometimes. I think we've talked a fair amount about, the Ukrainian side, obviously also the Russian side. But I do have one more question, which I think, again, is frequent sort of argument to support Russia. And I think I face this almost in a sense more just because, dealing with the third worldist left elements. So oftentimes their argument to back Russia will be because, oh, well, they're fighting against imperialism. So you have to basically be on the same side as that's dealing a blow to imperialism, right? Like the blows to imperialism, that's a common argument that I hear. I wonder, what would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's an argument we often get, and a lot, like sometimes we write things like, a Russian victory would be a blow to the United States, but it would not advance the interests of the working class. And for a lot of people, this seemed like a total contradiction. Like if you're against the United States oppressing the rest of the world, how is a blow against its interests, not advancing automatically the interests of the working class. Well, yeah, but it's concrete, Yes, it would be bad for the United States to lose in Ukraine, but it's not like Ukraine is a proxy regime of the United States. It's not like any kind of key strategic interest for the US to really hold control of Ukraine. It's really a product of American hubris, of kind of overextension, extending in zones that it doesn't even really care all that much about. So, it not dominating Ukraine is not like a huge blow to the United States. Well, it is a blow, but it's not like a critical blow to US imperialism. It will weaken the fight against imperialism by really locking in this national conflict. So it's going to have a negative long-term effect on the unity of the working class. And also the American army is not directly involved in, it's not fighting on the ground there. Now, I already said, they're collaborating, they're sending weapons and so on. But there's an actual material difference if there's American soldiers that are going and fighting and dying in Ukraine. That has the possibility of really creating revolutionary ferment in the United States itself. Like the defeat in Vietnam, the defeat in Iraq. Those created a lot of discontent within the United States. But that's not a prospect really for Ukraine because, the American soldiers are not there fighting on the ground. And a lot of groups, they think that, the fact that it's a proxy war is irrelevant. That basically there's no difference between the US being directly involved in a war, like it is in Iraq, or what's happening in Ukraine. But if you think about it a second, it's totally absurd, the US was conquering Iraq, it was destroying this country's national sovereignty. Whereas what it's doing now is it's not like invading Russia. There's no threat at this point of Russia's national sovereignty being threatened by the United States. But there's a number of groups, they use Trotsky, and they quote Trotsky about what he said about China and the Japanese, invading China and how you need to be on the side of the anti-imperialist side. And they're comparing in this analogy China and Russia. So they think that Russia's national existence is at stake in this war. It is actually quite insane and doesn't make any sense for anybody that actually thinks about it in a concrete way. But, that's what you get when you just try to apply very rigid, mechanic, dogmas to living politics.
Yeah. You look at things in isolation. Here's an anti-imperialist force. Here's the bad guys who are pro-imperialist. Let's support the good guys against the bad guys.
Exactly. But think about it. It makes no sense.
I think I just like to re-insist and bring it to what we started with, which is, to really understand wars not in little boxes, but the actual forces that are driving the conflict. And that happens, over time until quantity spills over into quality. Every war is concrete. It depends on what's at stake. What's this war actually being waged for, and what are the different sides fighting for? And I think to just draw a plus where the other side draws a minus is a totally bankrupt approach. I think that's pretty much all I have. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring in to wrap up our discussion?
No, I think you concluded very well.
Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, we've written some key articles on the Ukraine war. Some of them applied to the Western terrain and, to show how we've been trying to implement this perspective. And so I'll link those in the show notes. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.